Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the Great Depression. So the Great Depression really began with the crash of the stock market. You remember that was on October 29th of 1929, also known as Black Tuesday. And when you talk to historians, that's the moment when they say the Great Depression started. You can kind of see everything after that just completely falls apart. So October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday is the beginning of the Great Depression. The Great Depression will last from that Black Tuesday of 1929 until 1941. That will be when the United States enters World War II, so about 12 years. When we talk about the Great Depression, it was a time of extremely high unemployment. About 25% of Americans were out of work, so that's 1 in 4 people. If you think about how that would affect, if you had, think of you and 3 other of your friends, that would mean that 1 of you out of the 4 of you's parents wouldn't have a job. And especially in a time where it was primarily men that were working to support their families, this is going to have a devastating effect on families. The Great Depression is also seen as a time of the collapse of the banking system in the United States. We're going to see banks completely shut down. We're going to see the majority of banks in the U.S. actually close. So we see the collapse of the banking system. We also are going to see the downfall of the U.S. economy. The economy is going to flatline. It is just going to almost die during this depression. So, question. What is considered the start of the Great Depression? A. The beginning of the 1930s. B. Black Tuesday, the day the stock market crashed. Now we're going to look at the reasons. There's 4 main reasons for the Great Depression. 4 things that kind of led into or started the Great Depression. So the first was what we call a lack of foreign market for U.S. goods. Basically what this means is that we weren't able to really sell our stuff to Europe anymore. And there's a couple of things that happened with this, but following World War I, Europe needed our stuff. But pretty quickly they didn't need our stuff, they didn't have money, and so they stopped buying our crops, they stopped buying our equipment. And so now the U.S. is manufacturing, making all of these goods and food, and there's no one to buy it. We talked about this in the last one, easy credit. People were buying stuff when they had no money to buy it, and they had nothing put away. So if they lose their jobs, they're very quickly going to lose everything. The unequal distribution of wealth, we talked about this also, was that the rich were richer and the poor were poorer. And if you were poor, you were extremely poor during the Great Depression. Even in the 1920s, the rich were extremely rich, could have these lavish lifestyles, fancy, huge parties all the time, but the poor were very poor. And then the last one we talked a little bit about also before was farming problems or agricultural problems, so farm problems. Those things of making too much food without being able to sell it, not being able to get to understand that when they're growing all these extra crops, that it's destroying the environment. So this would be a good kind of overview if you want to take a screenshot or you want to take a picture of it, the reasons behind the Great Depression. So we're first going to talk kind of about the collapse of banks. One of the first things we see with the Great Depression is that the banks start to shut down. And the reason is that when the stock market crashed and people started losing money, a few people were like, hey, I'm going to go get my money out of the bank, because banks had also been buying stocks. And they're like, I'm going to go get my money out and make sure I can have my money. And when they did that, maybe their friends saw that too. And then their friends saw that. And pretty soon there's a line out the door of the bank. And people are like, well, if all those people are waiting to get their money, I better run in and get my money too. What if the bank runs out of money? And so you'd get these huge, giant lines. And you would have what they called a run on the bank where people were trying to get their money. And you can see this is a run. Now, it's different than today, because today, if you ever walk into a bank, you'll see there's this seal or like big emblem on the front of the banks or credit unions, and it says FDIC insured. What that means is today the federal government will insure your money. So if that bank closes or that bank runs out of money, the federal government will give you your money still. In the 1920s, if your bank closed or your bank ran out of money, you didn't get any money. It wouldn't matter how much money you had in that bank. If that bank closed down or didn't have money, you didn't get your money. So as banks are shutting down, more and more people are going to other banks trying to get their money, and more banks close, and people are losing their entire life savings. They are losing everything with all of these banks closing. And here's another picture so you can see these are people waiting in line to try and get in to get their money out of their bank. And you can imagine if everything you had was in a bank and you thought it was going to close down, you would be trying to get down there too. But all that did was it started another panic, and people had this hysteria again, this mass panic of, I've got to get in there. With the stock market crashing and banks closing, businesses are also going to start closing. People believed that the businesses were no longer safe. If you had money, you were not going to invest in anymore. You're going to pull your money out of businesses. And so what happened was that the people who owned the businesses, the owners or whoever was in charge of the business, they said, well, the only way we're going to make it, the only way our business isn't going to close is if we cut jobs, if we lay off workers, if we cut off those people. Like, we're just going to get down to where we only have a few people working for us. Because if we don't have to pay them, then that means we can save money. So businesses start laying off or firing workers. Well, what happened was, instead of saving the business, it hurts them even more. Because if you get fired from a job, you're not going to go out and buy any more goods. And if you don't go out and buy any more goods, then that business is going to close, and they're going to lay off workers who are no longer going to go and buy other stuff, and you have this huge like snowball effect that happens. And as I was saying before, by about 1933, about 25% of all American workers had lost their jobs. So 25% unemployment is extremely high. So now let's talk a little bit about what it was like to live during the Great Depression. This is one of my favorite pictures from the Great Depression. This is known as Migrant Mother. This is a woman with her children. It was taken by a woman named Dorothy Lang, and we'll talk a little bit more about her, but she was a photographer who went out and she actually took photos to document what it was like for these people living during the Great Depression. So we already kind of talked about how workers lost their jobs, they couldn't find new ones, and those workers who maybe still had their jobs, their pay got cut, sometimes in half or even like 3/4 of what they were making before. And when we talked about the fact that people already weren't making a ton of money, this is going to devastate them. What you're looking at in this picture, these are people, these are all men waiting in line trying to find a job. These men would go out every day and they would go down to these locations, and if someone had an odd job, they would go down there and they would hire random people who were standing around. And these guys are all trying to find, like, maybe there would be 2 or 3 jobs with all these people. When people couldn't find jobs, they lost their life savings. Very quickly, people stop having enough money for food. And so what happens is people stop being able to drink milk. They start drinking water. Eating meat was a luxury. Meat became pretty much non-existent. It was too expensive and people couldn't afford it. If you got meat, that was a big thing. in order to try and help, there were some organizations like the Salvation Army that would go out, and churches and these other like local community help would go in, and they would make breads and soups, and you had what were called bread lines, and this is where people could go and they would wait in line to get a loaf of bread every day. So we had soup kitchens just like we do today, but because there were so many people that had nothing, the soup kitchens couldn't keep up. They didn't have enough to help these people. And there wasn't any federal government, there wasn't state government help for these people. It was all charities that were trying to do this, and charities just could not handle the number of people that were coming through needing this help. I will tell you a story. For example, my grandpa grew up during the Great Depression in Montana, and he said they got meat maybe once a year unless something happened to one of their hogs. And when they got it, they ate everything on it. So you can imagine growing up through your childhood hardly ever seeing meat, unless you're a vegetarian, which is by choice. But if you're not a vegetarian, you were lucky then to get bread and vegetables. So there wasn't a lot of food, there wasn't clothing, people just had absolutely nothing. And this is just a picture. It's talking about how a lot of men who couldn't find jobs would try and go to another city to find jobs, and they would get there and there still were no jobs. This wasn't just one area of the United States, this was the entire United States. As the Great Depression continues on, we've talked about like not having food, not having money. Well, people were losing their houses, and so more and more families became homeless and were facing hunger. So what began to happen was that families started sleeping on park benches. They would go and sleep in empty railway cars. They took cardboard boxes and they would use those for houses. And in the bigger cities, what you see on the outskirts of the bigger cities is that these families would actually find a location and live all near each other in like these cardboard shacks. You can see like cars. They would try and find tents, building materials. It could be old pieces of wood. And they would basically build these ramshackle houses. And they would all live in this area, and those towns is what they kind of looked like. They started to be called Hoovervilles. Now, the reason they were called Hoovervilles is that the president at the time was Herbert Hoover. And Herbert Hoover really didn't do anything to help with the Great Depression. His idea is that people will figure it out. He would say, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Like, you can do this. You can figure it out. You don't need help from the government. What he didn't understand until it was too late was that this was such a huge thing that was happening. The economy was in such bad shape that people couldn't get out of it by themselves. The United States needed the intervention of the federal government in order to pull it out of the Great Depression. And so these people would call these towns Hoovervilles as a way of kind of getting back at Herbert Hoover, because they were like, hey, you're not even doing anything. You're a president. Help us out. Telling us to get tougher is not working. Like, we can't find jobs. We have no food. Help us. Here's another Hooverville, so you can see. And you can see the industries in the background. This kind of reminds me of like today when you'll see some of the slums in third world countries. That would be very close to what it was. Kind of ramshackle. You use whatever materials you can find. No running water, no sanitation. You can see like there's nowhere for like gardens. These are just thrown together somewhere to have so you have at least a roof over your head. And here's some more pictures so you can kind of see. You can see the kids didn't wear shoes. They didn't have money for shoes. Mom doesn't have shoes. they would make what they called sack flour dresses. Flour would come in these giant sacks of like 50-pound, 100-pound sacks. People would take those sacks and they would actually turn them into clothing because they were made out of cloth. So people would dig through the trashes, finding any little scraps of cloth they could to put together any kind of clothing that they could. So our question, what were Hoovervilles? A, a place where wealthy Americans lived in the Great Depression? Or B, a group of families who were homeless and lived in groups? A place where wealthy Americans lived in the Great Depression, or B, a group of families who were homeless and lived in groups. What were Hoovervilles? As I was talking about, Hoover took way too long to do anything. He could never find the right answer, and so the economy, the United States, just gets worse and worse and worse, and we sink into a bigger depression. You know, in Hoover's defense, he really did think that local charities would help everybody. That's kind of what had always happened. He wasn't really big into this idea of federal government helping people out. He thought that local cities and states could help the businesses, but it was just too big of a problem for cities or states or charities to handle. It really needed that federal intervention in order to help. So we've been talking a little bit about like the urban setting, people living in the cities. Urban means cities. What was it like if you were living in rural or out in the country in America? What was it like? Well, if you were a farmer, your crop prices continued to fall. They basically became worth nothing because people still have all of these crops and nowhere to sell them. If you were in the Great Plains, you were still in drought years. You basically, if you were able to get a crop, it wasn't going to be a great crop. You continually have no water for your crops or for yourself. And then if you somehow were able, to try and get together some kind of a crop, if you couldn't pay all that credit or all of those bills that you had from buying all that new machinery, your farm was taken away. And so what you see is that a ton of farmers begin to lose their farms, or they're forced to move or relocate to look for a new life. This will be what you know of in Oklahoma. You'll have in Oklahoma this huge migration from Oklahoma out to California. A lot of people will try and move to California to work on the fruit farms, looking for new lives. And so you see a lot of migratory people. People riding the trains, riding the rails, walking, trying to find work or trying to find new opportunities. So this is a picture. It just kind of shows you what it was like to live in one of those houses. You can see the kids are taking a bath in this little metal bucket. You can see they kind of tried to piece together the walls. You know, there's not a lot here. The floor, this one is actually pretty good. It looks like it was linoleum at one time. Some people even used like coffee can lids or the lids from cans. This graph is just kind of showing you what the prices for things, so how much things were worth. And you can see how the prices for crops or goods, anything that you made that you wanted to sell, just dropped. And while you see a little bit of a rise, you can see how low it is compared to the 1920s up here. So this is going to lead us into what's called the Dust Bowl. Just remembering that throughout the 20s, even throughout the early 1900s, we kind of had these big periods of drought in the out along the plains, and especially in the 1930s, this huge drought hits the Great Plains, and you can kind of see here how there's just nothing out there. You have just these like open, desolate dirt that's just everywhere. And what happened was that because of this drought and because the farmers had taken and plowed up those natural grasses that were found in the Great Plains, you're going to have these windstorms that are going to pick up all of this dust that is all over the ground, all of this dirt, this topsoil, those top layers of soil, and they're just going to pick it up into these great wind or clouds of dust. So you can see here, this is a farmer showing just how dry the soil is. There's no crops. So when we talk about the Dust Bowl, really it was primarily impacted these areas, like right through here. What was happening was that you had all of this right through here is the Great Plains. So all of that topsoil is just being literally just blown down to here in these areas. Just to give you kind of an idea of how big these dust storms were, like these clouds of dust were over 8,000 feet high in the air. They could move as fast as 100 miles per hour, and they would literally block out the sunlight. It looked like night. People would say that they could hear it coming, and it sounded like a freight train coming towards them. That's a lot of dust. I kind of already showed you Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, New Mexico, Colorado are going to be some of the worst hit areas. So question, what caused the Dust Bowl? A, giant clouds of topsoil from the Great Plains, or B, storms of dirt from the East Coast? So here's some pictures to show you. This is from the actual Dust Bowl. You can see this is a town down here. This is one of those giant wind dust storms coming. Here's the house. Imagine if you were out here playing outside. Now, if you were somehow lucky enough to get a crop and not get this huge Dust Bowl, well, guess what else was happening? There were plagues of locusts that were happening during this time, especially in the plains. Locusts are kind of like flying grasshoppers, and they literally eat everything in sight. These are some locusts that right here you can see. I mean, they would say these would like almost be so many it would block out the sun. They would build like these giant trenches like 3 to 4 feet deep and put stuff in it to kill off the locusts. There were so many in these plagues that they would literally fill up those trenches and make it even, and they would keep coming. You can see these are some grasshoppers. This is outside of Montana. Like literally there's just stubs left from a field. Interestingly enough, like locusts would literally eat the clothes off of your back. So not the best time to be it. So let's watch a little bit of an overview of the Great Depression from Mr. Betts.
Great Depression, when will it end? Great Depression, how'd it begin? Can't point to one simple cause. So many should have gave us pause. Let's review what we've been through that led to the Great Depression. Farmers felt it first of all. They grew more than before to fill world demand. Prices dropped, they flopped from overproduction. Depression. 1920s, profits explode. We produce more than demand slow. Was laid off, and it gets worse. The stock market bubble and burst. Banks were and ran with regulation, and this set off the Great Depression. Then came 1929. Did you lose all your stock in the big market crash? And your bank did it tank, and with it take your cash. Depression, Great Depression, Great Depression, Great Depression, Great. So I'm stuck with no dough to spend. 25% unemployment means no wage or salary. Can't join in the economy. Spend my time in the breadline to eat in the Great Depression. depression, 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 yeah. Herbert Hoover offers a dance, his rugged individualism will save us. Just grab your bootstraps. I like to strap them to the railroad tracks. In DC, the bonus army protesting the Great Depression. All these new tariff foods are remaining no trade. They open Hoover Dam, damn this mess Hoover made. He didn't cause it, but didn't help. He told us we should help ourselves. Now we live in a Hooverville. Can we please